At 4:52 in the morning, the Vatican was still dark. Not quiet. Dark. There is a difference. Quiet is what happens when a city rests. Dark is what happens when a room is holding something it does not yet know how to reveal. Inside the apostolic palace, behind a door guarded by 2 Swiss guards who had been told nothing, a single lamp burned over the papal desk. Its light fell on 3 objects arranged with almost surgical care. A small glass eel filled with gray ash, a black notebook open to a page covered in Pope Leo XIV's tight handwriting, and a cream-colored folder sealed with red wax. On the cover in Latin were 3 words, Corpus et Cinis, body and ash. The folder had arrived 27 minutes earlier from the Secretariat of State, but the Pope already knew what was inside. He had been asking for it for months, not because he wanted another document, not because he wished to open another theological debate for experts. He had asked for it because of the letters. There were 1,984 of them. They came from Mexico, Spain, Kenya, Argentina, Peru, the Philippines, Italy, Colombia, and the United States. Some were written by theologians, most were not. They came from widows, sons, daughters, nurses, parish catechists, funeral workers, and priests who had spent too many evenings answering frightened questions in sacristies after funerals. Holy Father, my mother was cremated. Did we fail her? Holy Father, my son asked for cremation. Can he still rise? Holy Father, we could not afford burial. Did poverty make us disobedient? Holy Father, my brother's ashes were scattered before we knew the Church's teaching. Is there mercy for us? Leo XIV had read them slowly, not as paperwork, as wounds. At the top of one letter, a woman from Puebla had written in blue ink, I am afraid that fire has taken away what God promised. The Pope had circled that sentence. Then, in the margin of his notebook, he had written the line that would later become the soul of the document. The promise of Christ is not afraid of ashes. Before we go further, remember what this story is, a dramatized Vatican-style documentary scenario, built from the text you provided. It is written in the style of a cinematic Catholic documentary, an investigative narrative, meant to explore the spiritual, pastoral, and institutional tension around cremation, dignity, memory, and the resurrection of the body. At 5:07, his personal secretary, Father Matteo Rinaldi, entered the room with fresh coffee and the silence of a man who knew better than to ask too many questions before dawn. The Pope did not look up. He was staring at the glass vial. Do you know what many families see when they look at this? Leo asked. Father Matteo waited. They see an ending, the Pope said. Some see guilt, some see fear, some see a mistake that cannot be repaired. He touched the folder with 2 fingers. But the Church must teach them to see a seed. That was the moment Father Matteo understood the document would not be a technical clarification. It would be a confrontation, not against cremation itself, against fear, against superstition, against the cold modern habit of treating the body as disposable, against the sentimental temptation to turn ashes into private objects, jewelry, decorations, or poetic gestures severed from prayer, and against an institutional silence that had allowed millions of Catholics to live with uncertainty about one of the most tender questions a human being can ask. What happens to the body of someone I loved? By noon, the world would know the title, Corpus et Cinis. By evening, Catholic media would call it the Ashes document. By midnight, the Vatican would be split between those who called it pastoral mercy and those who called it dangerous confusion. But at 5:18 that morning, before headlines, before reaction panels, before bishops issued cautious statements, the Pope opened the folder and read the first sentence aloud. Neither fire nor earth can erase the promise of Christ. Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time that morning he smiled. Not because the matter was easy, because the fear was about to lose its throne. To understand why Corpus et Cinis mattered so deeply, you must go back before the document, before the press conference, before the Roman corridors began whispering that Leo XIV was touching another dangerous subject. You must go back to the oldest Christian cemeteries, the catacombs, the narrow stone corridors beneath Rome, where early believers carried their dead not as defeated bodies, but as sleeping witnesses. They placed them in the earth with lamps, prayers, names, symbols, and the quiet conviction that death was not the last owner of the human body. Those underground chambers were not archives of loss. They were seedbeds. The dead were not thrown away. They were placed, named, remembered, surrounded by prayer. Their bodies rested near martyrs, near Eucharistic gatherings, near the signs of a faith that dared to speak of resurrection under an empire that believed death was final. That is why Christian burial became so powerful. It was not only custom, it was proclamation. The body was placed in the earth, as Christ had been placed in the tomb, wrapped, mourned, guarded by love, and entrusted to the Father. For centuries, the Church preferred burial because burial preached with silence. A grave said this body matters. A name on stone said this person has not vanished. A cross said therefore this death belongs to Christ. A cemetery said wait together. But history was never simple. Cremation had long carried a complicated meaning in Christian memory. In some ancient pagan cultures, it belonged to rites and philosophies that did not confess the resurrection of the body. In later centuries, especially in modern anti-Christian movements, cremation could be chosen as a deliberate rejection of the faith. It could become a statement: I do not believe the body will rise. I do not believe death will be reversed. I do not believe the Church has anything to say over my remains. Because of that, Catholic suspicion did not come from nothing. It had a history, but pastoral history changes when human circumstances change. Cities filled, cemetery space became scarce, families moved across countries, funeral costs rose, hospitals asked questions quickly, migrants died far from home, children tried to honor parents while navigating modern systems built more for efficiency than mourning. And Catholics were left asking, what does fidelity look like now? The Church had already answered in previous decades. Cremation was permitted when it was not chosen for reasons contrary to the Christian faith. Burial remained preferred because it expressed the paschal hope more visibly. Ashes were to be kept in sacred places, not scattered, divided, or turned into private objects. Those norms existed, but ordinary people often did not know them, or they heard only fragments. A priest said one thing, a funeral director said another. A relative quoted something from decades ago. A friend from another church said Catholics who cremate deny resurrection. A viral post accused families of betraying the body. A grieving daughter sat beside an urn at midnight and wondered if she had condemned the person she loved. That was the wound Leo XIV found in the letters. Not rebellion. Fear. The Pope understood fear. His years in the peripheries had taught him that doctrine does not reach the poor as an abstract system. It reaches them as a question spoken with trembling hands. Can I bury my mother with dignity? Can God find my child in ashes? Can poverty force me into sin? Can a mistake made in grief be healed by mercy? Those questions entered the Vatican and sat on the Pope's desk like a second congregation. And Leo XIV, quiet and watchful, did what he often did. He did not answer immediately. He listened. He asked the congregation for doctrine for summaries. He asked bishops for pastoral reports. He asked funeral chaplains what families were asking. He asked canon lawyers where confusion remained. He asked theologians to prepare notes on the resurrection of the body, the dignity of the human person, and the meaning of sacred places. But more than anything, he asked for stories. A mother in Mexico, a catechist in Nairobi, a university student in Barcelona, an old farmer in the Andes, a widower in Naples who kept his wife's urn in a bedroom because he could not bear to let go, a nurse in Manila who watched families choose cremation because they had no money for a traditional burial and then leave the hospital ashamed. By the end of the third month, the Pope had filled a black notebook with testimonies. On the first page, he wrote 2 columns: fear, hope. Under fear, he wrote guilt, superstition, silence, poverty, confusion, sentimental possession, loss of community. Under hope, he wrote resurrection, dignity, name, sacred place, prayer, body, seed. The document began there, not in legal language, in 2 columns drawn by a pope who understood that the Church does not heal grief by winning arguments. She heals grief by naming the wound and placing it under the light of Christ. Corpus et Cinis would not abolish the Church's preference for burial. It would not bless every modern practice around ashes. It would not reduce the body to a symbol. It would do something harder. It would hold together mercy and discipline. Yes, cremation can be permitted. No, ashes are not trash. Yes, God can raise the dead from dust, ash, sea, or nothing at all. No, families may not treat the remains of a human person like jewelry, decoration, or private property. Yes, grief needs tenderness. No, tenderness cannot erase truth. That was the line Leo XIV wanted to walk. And in the Vatican, lines like that are dangerous, because every faction can misunderstand them. Some traditionalists feared he would normalize a practice they saw as a concession to modernity. Some progressives feared he would impose burdens on grieving families. Some bishops feared a new wave of pastoral questions. Some funeral industries feared clearer rules. Some families feared being told they had already done something wrong. Leo XIV knew all of that. He also knew silence had already failed. So at 9:30 that morning, in a room near the Apostolic Library, he met with 12 people. 3 cardinals, 2 women theologians, a canon lawyer, a funeral chaplain, a bishop from Africa, a parish priest from Latin America, a mother whose son had been cremated, a doctor who had worked in hospice, and a young seminarian whose father's ashes had been scattered at sea before the family understood church teaching. No cameras were present. The Pope placed the glass vial in the center of the table, not to shock them, to focus them. This, he said, is where theology meets the trembling hand of a mother. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the mother began to cry. Her name was Elena Morales. She had come from Puebla. Her son Daniel had died at 26. Before his death, he had asked to be cremated. She had obeyed him. Later, a neighbor told her the church did not approve. Another told her God could not raise ashes. Someone online said she had chosen convenience over faith. For 3 years, she had prayed with guilt. I did not stop loving my son, she told the Pope. But I began to fear I had failed his soul. Leo XIV listened without interrupting. Then he said, "No mother should be left alone with a fear the church can clarify." That sentence would not appear in the final document, but everyone in the room remembered it. The first major section of Corpus et Cinis opened by reaffirming the ancient preference. Burial remains the sign the church loves most. Not because earth is stronger than fire, not because God needs bones in order to resurrect, but because burial speaks visibly of Christ. The body rests as seed. The cemetery becomes a field of waiting. The tomb becomes a catechism in stone. The Christian grave says what the creed says: I await the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Leo XIV wrote that the buried body preaches in silence. It preaches to children walking between graves. It preaches to widows lighting candles. It preaches to the old who know their own names will one day be carved beside those they love. It preaches to the church that salvation is not escape from the body, but redemption of the whole person. The body matters, not only while it is useful, not only while it is healthy, not only while it is beautiful. The body matters because God created it, Christ assumed it, the Spirit sanctified it, and the Father will raise it. This was the theological heart of the document. The body is not a costume for the soul. It is not a disposable container. It is not biological packaging. It is part of the person. With the body, we were baptized. With the body, we received the Eucharist. With the body, we embraced our children, worked, forgave, suffered, knelt, served, sinned, repented, and loved. The body carries the history of grace. So even after death, it is not waste. Leo XIV put it sharply: what has been temple does not become trash. That line, when leaked later, traveled across Catholic media with astonishing speed. It cut through both modern indifference and religious confusion. For the secular mind, it challenged the habit of treating remains as private material, to be customized however grief desires. For the superstitious mind, it challenged the fear that a change in physical form could defeat divine power. The Pope was not interested in either error. The Christian body must be honored, and God is not helpless before ashes. That brought the document to its second certainty. Cremation, when not chosen against the faith, does not prevent resurrection. Leo XIV stated this with unusual force because he knew many families needed to hear it without ambiguity. The resurrection is not a reconstruction project limited by the visibility of remains. God is not an archaeologist searching for missing fragments. God is creator. He called the universe from nothing. He formed Adam from dust. He raised Christ from the tomb. He can glorify what the world calls impossible. If a body is buried, God can raise it. If a body is burned, God can raise it. If a body is lost at sea, God can raise it. If a martyr is scattered, God can raise him. If centuries have turned bones to dust, God does not forget the name. That was why the Pope wrote, "The last word over the beloved dead belongs neither to fire nor to earth, but to Christ, who conquered death." This line brought comfort, but it also carried a warning, because if cremation is permitted, it must still be lived Christianly. Permission is not indifference. Mercy is not carelessness. The fact that God can raise ashes does not mean ashes may be treated, however the living desire. And this was where Corpus et Cinis became controversial. The third major section addressed what could not be done. Ashes must not be scattered in the sea, the wind, mountains, forests, or private gardens, as if the person were dissolving into an impersonal universe. Ashes must not be divided among family members, because the body was one, and the sign of hope should remain whole. Ashes must not be transformed into necklaces, rings, sculptures, keepsakes, or decorative objects. Ashes must not be kept indefinitely at home as private property severed from the prayer of the church. The words were firm, not cruel. Firm. The wind is not an altar. The Pope wrote, the sea is not a columbarium. The human body is not a memory object. What God has called by name must not be dissolved into anonymity. That sentence triggered the first wave of backlash. Some commentators called it insensitive. Some funeral industry voices called it outdated. Some Catholics who had scattered ashes felt wounded. Some secular journalists mocked the idea that the church would tell grieving families what to do with remains. But Leo XIV had anticipated the reaction. In a passage added late in the drafting process, he wrote directly to families who had made decisions before knowing the teaching. Do not despair. The mercy of God is greater than your confusion, your haste, your poverty, your grief, or your mistakes. If what was done cannot be undone, let prayer now do what knowledge could not do then. This was vintage Leo XIV. He drew a line. Then he opened a door. He did not say the church's teaching no longer mattered. He said mercy could meet people where knowledge had failed them. He encouraged families, where possible, to create a sacred sign now, a plaque, a memorial mass, a name placed in a parish book, a visit to a cemetery, a family prayer before a crucifix, a donation to the poor in the name of the deceased. Not because these gestures undo everything, because faith can begin again. When the document was released at noon, the Vatican press room filled beyond capacity. The prefect read the summary. Journalists immediately raised questions. Does this change doctrine? Number. Does it permit cremation? It clarifies the permission. Does it prohibit scattering ashes? Yes, except where extraordinary circumstances require pastoral discernment. But the norm remains sacred custody. What about families who already scattered ashes? They are not to be crushed by fear. They are to be accompanied toward prayer and hope. What about poverty? The church must create dignified, affordable, sacred options. That last answer mattered, because one of the most investigative parts of the document was not theological at all. It was institutional. Leo XIV demanded that dioceses examine whether Catholic burial and columbarium options had become financially inaccessible to the poor. He wrote, if the church teaches sacred custody, then she must not make sacred custody a privilege of the wealthy. That line caused discomfort in more than one chancery office. Because cemetery systems, parish columbaria, funeral partnerships, diocesan fees, and memorial costs are not abstract. They involve money, contracts, land, maintenance, revenue, access. The Pope had taken a question about cremation and exposed another wound, the commercialization of Catholic mourning. A Catholic mother should not have to choose between obedience and rent. A grieving son should not be priced out of sacred memory. A poor parish should not be told to honor norms while given no practical means to do so. So Corpus et Cinis called for a global review of diocesan funeral practices. Transparent fees, low-cost sacred options, parish columbaria where possible, communal memorial spaces for the poor, clear catechesis before families are in crisis, and pastoral teams trained not only to recite regulations, but to sit beside grief without rushing it. This was the investigative edge of the document. It did not only ask families to obey, it asked the institution whether it had made obedience too expensive. That was why some bishops praised the document in public, but worried about it in private. Doctrine was manageable. Budgets were harder. By the evening, reaction had spread across continents. In Mexico, Elena Morales watched the broadcast from her parish hall. When the sentence appeared on screen, neither fire nor earth can erase the promise of Christ, she covered her mouth and sobbed. Not because the grief disappeared, because guilt lucento bicuri pusenit. Her priest later said she came to the columbarium the next Sunday with white flowers, placed them beneath Daniel's name, and whispered, "You are not lost, you are planted." In Nairobi, a catechist named Joseph gathered families in a chapel built with tin roofing and painted concrete. Many had chosen cremation because burial plots were impossibly expensive. He read the Pope's words aloud in Swahili and then looked at the people in front of him. "We need a sacred place," he said. They had no marble, no polished plaques, no architectural plan, so they built a wooden wall beside the chapel. They placed small crosses. They wrote names by hand. They hung a simple cloth beneath a crucifix. Every Friday, families came with candles. Children asked questions. Grandmothers answered. The poor had made a columbarium of hope. In Barcelona, a university student named Luis had not prayed for his grandfather in years. His grandfather's ashes had been kept in a family cabinet, half forgotten behind documents and old photographs. After reading one line from the document, "Every urn should become a catechesis of resurrection," Luis asked his mother if they could bring the ashes to the parish columbarium. The mother resisted at first. "It feels like giving him away," she said. Luis answered, "Maybe it is giving him back." 3 weeks later, they processed quietly into the parish church. No cameras, no dramatic music, just a priest, a candle, Psalm 23, and a name. The mother wept through the prayer. But when it ended, she said, "Now I know where to bring my grief." In the Andes, an old farmer named Tomas heard the Pope's phrase that ashes are seeds. He laughed softly and told the missionary, "Rome is late. The earth told us that long ago." Then he pointed to the fields. "You bury what you trust will live." The missionary repeated that line in a homily. It traveled through villages, then through Catholic radio, then across social media. "You bury what you trust will live." Leo XIV saw it 2 days later in a printed briefing. He underlined it. Then he wrote in the margin, "The poor often understand resurrection before the educated explain it." That line never became official, but it captured the spirit of the document. The Pope was not trying to invent new faith. He was trying to return the Church to the simple grammar of hope. Name, body, prayer, place, promise. Those 5 words became the structure of several diocesan workshops within weeks. Name, because the dead are not anonymous. Body, because the person is not a ghost trapped in memory. Prayer, because love continues in intercession. Place, because grief needs somewhere to kneel. Promise, because Christ has conquered death. But as with every major act of Leo XIV's pontificate, the resistance arrived. Some conservative voices accused him of softening the Church's historic preference for burial by speaking too tenderly about cremation. Some progressive voices accused him of imposing religious control over private grief. Some secular commentators said the Church had no right to tell families what to do with ashes. A few Catholic influencers turned the document into a battlefield. One side shouted, "Burial only." Another shouted, "Ashes belong to the family." Leo XIV answered neither side directly. 3 days after the release, at the Angelus, he spoke for less than 4 minutes. He said, "The dead are not possessions of the living. They are beloved of God. We do not own them through memory. We accompany them through prayer." That sentence quieted some. Not all, but some. Then he added, "The Church prefers burial, permits cremation, forbids contempt, and commands hope." Those 4 verbs became the simplest summary of Corpus et Cinis. Prefers, permits, forbids, commands, prefers burial, permits cremation, forbids contempt for the body, commands hope in the resurrection. The clarity helped parish priests. Within days, dioceses began preparing catechetical guides. Funeral homes requested meetings with bishops. Families wrote asking how to transfer urns to columbaria. Some parishes announced annual masses for those who had been cremated. Others created books of names for families whose loved ones' ashes had already been scattered and could not be recovered. That last initiative moved the Pope deeply. A parish in the Philippines placed a book near the Marian altar. The cover read, "Names Awaiting Glory." Families wrote the names of loved ones whose ashes had been scattered before they knew the teaching. Every Saturday, the parish prayed for them. When Leo XIV heard of it, he asked for a photograph. He kept it on his desk for a week, because that was what he wanted. Not panic, not shame, conversion of memory. The document's practical guidelines became one of its most widely used sections. Before cremation, pray. Write a spiritual testimony if you choose cremation, making clear you do not reject the resurrection. Celebrate the funeral rites with dignity. Do not reduce the process to paperwork. Keep Christian signs present. A cross, a candle, scripture, holy water, the prayer of the church. If possible, celebrate the funeral mass before cremation. After cremation, place the ashes in a sacred location. Continue praying. Visit. Offer masses. Teach children what the church believes. Connect memory with charity. Feed the poor in the name of the dead. Visit the sick. Forgive someone. Let grief become mercy. This pastoral path transformed the tone of the debate, because it was difficult to accuse the document of being only restrictive when so much of it was devoted to tenderness. Leo XIV knew grief needs form. Without form, grief becomes a fog. With Christian form, grief becomes pilgrimage. A candle, a psalm, a name, a place, a mass, a work of mercy, one step after another. That is how the church walks with the dead and the living at the same time. The most moving public moment came 1 month after publication. The Vatican organized a simple evening prayer in the Campo Santo Teutonico, the small cemetery near St. Peter's. Attendance was expected to be modest. Instead, thousands gathered outside, and the prayer had to be broadcast to the square. On the altar stood no golden display, only a wooden cross, a bowl of ashes, not human ashes, but blessed ashes from burned olive branches, and a book filled with names submitted from around the world. The Pope stood before the book. He did not give a long homily. He read names: Maria, Daniel, Kofi, Teresa, Luis, Anna, Joseph, Lucia. 1,000 cameras recorded him, but the moment felt strangely private. After each set of names, the crowd responded, "Christ, remember them." At the end, Leo XIV placed his hand on the book and prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive those whom we remember in tears. Gather what was scattered, heal what was wounded, raise what has fallen asleep. Teach us to honor the body, guard the ashes, and hope without fear." Many wept, not because anything new had been defined in that moment, because something ancient had been made close. The resurrection of the body was no longer only a line in the creed. It had become Daniel's name, Maria's ashes, a mother's guilt, a poor parish's wooden wall, a young man's return to prayer, a pope's hand resting on a book of the dead. That is when Corpus at Cinis crossed from document into devotion. And once a document becomes prayer, no office can fully control it. Weeks later, reports began arriving from dioceses. In Italy, visits to Columbia increased. In Mexico, parishes began monthly masses for families who had chosen cremation. In Kenya, low-cost memorial walls spread from one parish to another. In Spain, theologians organized seminars on the resurrection of the body. In the United States, funeral directors asked dioceses for clearer partnerships. In Peru, catechists taught children to say, "A Christian body is never garbage." In the Philippines, the Names Awaiting Glory book became a national model. But there were also harder reports. Families angry that they had scattered ashes and now felt accused. Parishes without resources to create sacred places. Bishops unsure how to enforce norms without sounding cruel. Funeral homes resisting changes that complicated their services. Catholics who still believed cremation was sinful, despite the document. Others who insisted ashes should belong entirely to the family. The Pope read both kinds of reports: praise and resistance, comfort and confusion, and in his notebook, he wrote, "Do not let clarity become a stone thrown at grief." That line shaped the next instruction, a short pastoral note sent to bishops 3 months later. It told them to teach firmly but accompany gently. It asked them to correct errors without humiliating families. It urged them to create sacred solutions before issuing prohibitions. It insisted that priests speak of cremation not from annoyance, but from Easter. From Easter. That phrase mattered, because Leo XIV knew the Church can sound cold when she speaks from law alone. But when she speaks from Easter, even law becomes a lamp. The final section of Corpus et Cinis returned to the scene that every Christian must face, eventually. A family standing before death. A bed. A hospital room. A phone call before dawn. A funeral home appointment. A box of clothes. A priest arriving with oil. A son signing papers with shaking hands. A daughter choosing between burial and cremation because the family cannot afford both. A widow holding an urn and wondering where grief is supposed to live now. The Pope addressed them directly. If you have buried someone, if you have cremated someone, hope. If you were confused, hope. If you made mistakes, hope. If the ashes are in a sacred place, visit and pray. If they are not, seek counsel. If they cannot be recovered, entrust the name to the church. If guilt has entered your grief, give it to Christ. If the body was loved by God, it has not been forgotten by God. This was the mercy at the center of the teaching. Not permission without truth, not rules without tenderness, hope with a backbone. That is perhaps why the document resonated so widely. It did not say death is easy. It did not say ashes are nothing. It did not say every choice is equal. It said the Christian dead belong to Christ, and because they belong to Christ, the living must not treat them with despair, possession, or indifference. They must treat them with reverence. The last public scene came 40 days after the publication. Pope Leo XIV stood in St. Peter's Square during a special catechesis on the Creed. The line that day was simple. I believe in the resurrection of the body. He asked the crowd to place a hand over the heart and remember one person who had died. The square grew still. Thousands of hands moved to thousands of chests. Names were spoken silently in Spanish, Italian, English, French, Tagalog, Polish, Swahili, Portuguese, Vietnamese, and languages no microphone could catch. The Pope waited. Then he said, "The name you carry is not lost. The body you mourn is not despised. The ashes you fear are not beyond Christ. What is sown in tears will be raised in glory." No one applauded at first. Some prayed, some cried, some looked at the sky. For once, the cameras did not matter. The moment belonged to the dead and the living together. Then Leo XIV gave the blessing. Not dramatic, not theatrical, a father's blessing. When he returned to the apostolic palace, the cream-colored folder was still on his desk. The glass vial had been moved to a small shelf beside the crucifix. The black notebook remained open. On the final page, the Pope wrote one sentence: "Ashes are not the opposite of resurrection. They are the place where faith learns to wait." He closed the notebook. Outside, the bells began to ring, and across the world, in columbaria, cemeteries, chapels, living rooms, and poor parishes with wooden crosses, people began saying names again. Not as endings, as seeds, but a document like Corpus et Cinis could not remain only a devotional text. Once it entered the life of the Church, it also entered the machinery of bishops' conferences, funeral ministries, chancery offices, parish budgets, and family arguments around kitchen tables. That is where the second drama began. In Rome, the first implementation meeting took place behind closed doors in a narrow conference room near the Congregation for Divine Worship. The table was covered with printed copies of the document, translation drafts, canon law notes, and reports from dioceses where cremation had already become the majority practice. Some bishops wanted a slow rollout. Others wanted immediate catechesis. A few worried that the document would reopen wounds in families who had already made decisions that could not be reversed. One archbishop from Northern Europe spoke first. "Holy Father," he said, "we must be careful. If priests preach this without tenderness, many will hear only condemnation." Leo XIV nodded. "That is why they must not preach it from fear," he answered. "They must preach it from Easter." A bishop from Latin America raised the question of poverty. In his diocese, burial costs had become impossible for many working families. The existing columbarium was full. The cemetery was far away. Funeral homes had turned grief into a market with polished packages and prices that embarrassed the poor. "What do I tell them?" he asked. "That the Church permits cremation but has no sacred place for their ashes?" The Pope closed his notebook. "No," he said. "You tell your diocese that the poor must not be priced out of hope. Then you build what you can. A wall, a chapel, a book of names, a garden with a cross. The sign may be humble. It must be sacred." That sentence changed the meeting, because it revealed the hidden pressure inside the document. Corpus et Cinis was not only asking families to treat ashes with reverence, it was asking the Church to create conditions where reverence was actually possible. Within weeks, diocesan finance offices began receiving uncomfortable questions. How much does a niche cost? Who sets cemetery fees? Why do poor families sometimes receive more paperwork than pastoral care? Why are some parish columbaria accessible only to donors? Why do funeral directors sometimes explain church rules more clearly than priests? These were not abstract matters. They involved invoices, contracts, land, maintenance funds, insurance, and suddenly the phrase ashes or seeds was forcing accountants to answer theological questions. One Vatican official, irritated by the pressure, reportedly said, "The Pope has turned columbaria into a moral issue." A young priest who heard the remark answered, "They always were. We were just pretending marble was neutral." The Pope's next move deepened the pressure. He asked every diocese to prepare, within 1 year, a pastoral plan for Christian funerals in an age of cremation, not merely a legal policy, a pastoral plan. It had to include catechesis before death, guidance for families, affordable sacred spaces, training for funeral ministers, annual masses for the dead, and a special provision for families who had already scattered ashes or kept them at home without understanding the Church's teaching. That last point mattered most to Leo XIV. He had no interest in creating a new class of ashamed Catholics. He wanted a path back. So the plan included what many began calling the rite of entrusted names. It was not a sacrament, it was not a replacement for burial or proper custody of ashes. It was a simple pastoral prayer for situations that could not be fully repaired. Families would come to the parish, they would write the name of the deceased in a book, they would light a candle. The priest would pray, "Lord, what we could not guard, you remember. What grief scattered, your mercy gathers. What we did not know how to honor, teach us now to entrust." The rite spread quickly. In Manila, people lined up for 2 hours to write names. In Buenos Aires, a priest said the book became heavier than the altar missal. In New Jersey, a woman who had scattered her husband's ashes at a lake came to the parish in tears. She told the priest, "I cannot get them back." The priest answered, "Then bring his name." That was the tenderness Leo XIV wanted. Not denial, not panic. A name brought back into prayer. Still, the criticism sharpened. Some theologians warned that the rite of entrusted names could be misread as a soft approval of forbidden practices. Others argued that the Pope was creating unnecessary emotional rituals. A few traditionalist publications accused him of weakening the Church's burial preference with pastoral exceptions. Leo XIV answered in a private note to the bishops, "Truth without a path becomes a wall. Mercy without truth becomes fog. Give the faithful neither wall nor fog, give them a road." Those 3 words, "give them a road," became the unofficial motto of the implementation stage. And it worked because ordinary Catholics understood roads. They understood that grief does not move in straight lines. It circles, it stops, it returns to the same photograph. It opens a drawer and breaks down over a shirt. It hears a song and cannot breathe. It visits a columbarium with flowers, then forgets for months, then returns guilty. It wants signs because love needs places to go. The Pope understood that deeply. His investigation into the pastoral reality of cremation had shown that the greatest danger was not cremation itself. It was isolation, families making decisions alone, families receiving contradictory advice, families reducing faith to a funeral option checked on a form, families leaving the Church out of the most Christian moment of all, entrusting the dead to resurrection. That was why he spoke again at a funeral ministry conference 6 weeks later. He entered the hall without ceremony, carrying no folder this time, only the black notebook. "Do not become technicians of grief," he told the priests, deacons, sisters, chaplains, and lay ministers gathered before him. The funeral is not a service provided. It is a wound accompanied. The urn is not a package delivered. It is a body remembered under the form of ash. The family is not a client. They are the Church trembling. The room was silent. Then he gave them 5 commands. Teach before crisis. Listen before correcting. Pray before explaining. Provide sacred places before forbidding private ones. And never speak of the dead as objects. These commands were printed and taped inside sacristies across the world. Some priests loved them, some resented them, but families noticed. A widow in Ireland said her priest no longer treated her questions as administrative inconvenience. A Filipino father said he finally understood why the urn could not stay permanently on the television shelf. A grandmother in Colombia said her grandchildren now asked to pray for their cremated grandfather because they had seen his name in the parish book. Slowly, Corpus et Cinis changed not only what people believed about ashes, it changed where they brought their grief. Back to the church, back to the altar, back to the communion of saints. And that may have been the deepest victory of the document. Not that it clarified cremation, that it restored the dead to the prayer of the living. The investigative aftermath also revealed something uncomfortable. Many Catholics had never been taught the resurrection of the body clearly. They believed in heaven vaguely, in souls floating somewhere, in memories continuing, in loved ones watching over them. But the creed's hard, physical, shocking promise that the body itself will be raised had become dim. Leo XIV saw this as the real crisis. Cremation had exposed a catechetical failure. So he ordered a year-long catechesis on the final things: death, judgment, heaven, hell, purgatory, and the resurrection of the body. He did not want morbid fascination. He wanted Christian realism. He wanted Catholics to stop treating death as either taboo or vague comfort. Hope, he said, must be more solid than sentiment. That sentence belonged beside all the others, because Corpus et Cinis at its deepest level was not about what fire does to flesh. It was about what Christ does to death. If this story touched you, share it with someone carrying grief. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and write the name of a loved one you want remembered in prayer. How does your family live the hope of resurrection when cremation is part of the story? And subscribe for the next chapter, where we will go deeper into the Christian meaning of grief, memory, and the promise that death does not get the last word. Because the fire may consume the body, the earth may cover the grave, the sea may hide what we cannot hold, but Christ remembers every name, and what Christ remembers death cannot keep.